Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Daryl Kimball. I'm Executive Director of the Arms Control Association here in Washington, D.C. Our nation and the world is facing a daunting array of challenges: a global pandemic, economic havoc, structures of political and resource inequality, and discriminatory police violence. Another is the looming threat posed by nuclear weapons. These issues are inextricably linked. As the writer and civil rights activist James Baldwin said way back in 1961, racial hatred and the atom bomb both threatened the destruction of people as created free by God. And as Randall Forsberg, a former Arms Control Association board member, said at the June 12, 1982 rally in Central Park, until the arms race stops, until we have a world with peace and justice, we will not go home and be quiet. We will go home and organize. So those are some of the values that still drive our work today, and they're very much the inspiration for today's webinar, which is the first in a series that we're hosting with our partners at the Reaching Critical Will project of the Women's International League for Peace with Freedom on critical issues facing the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty as we all prepare for the delayed 10th Review Conference, probably in 2021. We're going to have future webinars, approximately one per month, that will address steps to fulfill Article 6 disarmament commitments under the Nonproliferation Treaty, how the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons relates and complements the NPT, the Nonproliferation Treaty and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, and the future of the New START Treaty and steps towards multilateral nuclear disarmament. And Ray Atchison with the Reaching Critical Will project, who's our partner in this series, is going to be moderating today's session along with our expert panelists. Thanks everybody for joining us. And now I'm going to turn things over to Ray.
Thank you, Daryl, and thank you to our panelists and for everybody that is joining us here today. It looks like we're almost at 200. Oh, we just reached 200 participants, and so that number might go up some more. Thank you very much, everyone, for being with us here today in extremely troubling times. Like Daryl, I want to acknowledge what's happening here in the United States, where many of us on this call are immigrants or citizens, and to say that what we're seeing right now isn't new. Of course, it's a product of white supremacy that's embedded in our institutions. It's the product of militarism, of police, and of funding agents of coercive state power at the expense of education, healthcare, housing, and justice. And nuclear weapons, of course, fit into the system of white supremacy, of racism, militarism, capitalism, patriarchy, whether it's nuclear testing and uranium mining and nuclear waste on indigenous lands, or if it's the culture of treating people of color as if their lives do not matter, or investing in weapons and structures of violence and control instead of in the things that would actually make our countries and our communities safer. This is all important context for our webinar today, which is focusing on nuclear weapon modernization and the new nuclear arms race. Nuclear weapon modernization is still ongoing in the time of pandemic. We've heard US officials say that modernization will continue unabated. Weapons factories have been deemed essential services, and officials are saying to all of us not to worry, they can still launch nuclear weapons regardless of social distancing. Now with threats from the US president to deploy the military in US cities against unarmed protesters, we are very concerned about relying on the military to refuse orders, including in relation to the use of nuclear weapons. So we need to do the work of organizing for peace and justice, as we have always done, by centering the voices and perspectives and lived reality of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and by abolishing the systems of violent racism, police, prisons, borders, militarisms, and abolishing the weapons that bring the sense of power and entitlement and exceptionalism that we're seeing on full display today, and nuclear weapons are, of course, a key part of that. Our speakers here today are going to talk about the new nuclear arms race, multilateral action for nuclear disarmament, and resisting nuclear weapons spending during the pandemic and beyond. This webinar is also serving as a launch for Reaching Critical Will's latest edition of Assuring Destruction Forever, which is our annual report on nuclear weapon modernization. It's going to be released this week, and several of the speakers here today have chapters in that, so please do look out for it. And if you're interested in more of our work on broader issues around violence and militarism, you can also check out WILP's blog that we've been running the last few months at wilp.org. After the speakers present, we're going to open up for question and answers. We'd like to remind people to ask questions that are relevant to what they've heard in the presentations. As Daryl said, this is a series of events and we'll be exploring other topics in the future. So today is focused on modernization. And if you can also direct your question to a specific panelist, if possible, that's always very helpful and welcome. And if you are asking the question, to be sure to introduce yourself clearly at the beginning. I'm going to introduce speakers one by one before they speak. So I'm going to start today with Hans Kristensen, who is director of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists in Washington, D.C. He's responsible for researching and documenting the status and operations of nuclear forces of the 9 nuclear armed states. Among other things, he is co-author of the bi-monthly Federation of American Scientists Nuclear Notebook column in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and the World Nuclear Forces Overview in the SIPRI Yearbook. And he's also contributed a chapter to Assuring Destruction Forever. So Hans, I'm gonna pass it over to you. Take it away, thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Good morning, everyone, or wherever you are in the world. And thanks for the invitation to contribute on this important topic. I've been asked to speak on the status of US, Russian, and Chinese modernization programs. So before I start, just a little backdrop and a status, which is, of course, how far we've come. There's been a lot of progress over the decades in limiting nuclear forces, both their numbers, but also their mission. And proliferation, as we feared it back in the 1960s and 70s, has been much, much less. Fewer countries have acquired nuclear weapons but some, of course, have joined the club. So now, today, we have these 9 countries. But what should strike you about this, of course, is the enormous difference there is between what Russia and the United States believe they need for national security and that what everybody else thinks is necessary. Some of that, of course, has to do with where we come from, the Cold War. Those were the 2 main drivers. They're still somewhat stuck in that mindset. Also perceptions about how they project security to their allies and these types of things. So this all influences it, but this is a vast disparity, of course, that still exists. We're down to just about 9,500 weapons in the stockpiles around the world. But if you also include weapons that are in the queue for dismantlement, the number is significantly greater. It's more than 13,000 that are still there. But what you should focus on here, of course, is not how much things have changed compared to the Cold War, but where we are today and what is likely to happen in the near future. And so at the bottom right, you can sort of see the trends for the different types of nuclear weapon states in terms of their arsenals. We have countries that are decreasing their stockpiles, that is the United States and Britain. We have countries that are increasing, that is China, Pakistan, India, North Korea, and possibly also Russia. And we have countries that are sort of steady in their arsenal. They don't seem to be eager to rather increase or decrease, and that's France and Israel. Next one. But here we are 30 years after the end of the Cold War. We are in a very dynamic time when it comes to way nuclear forces are operated, the way countries talk about the role of their nuclear forces, and what they're doing with them. So what's clear, of course, is that the window of opportunity, if you could say that, of the thaw in relations after, or the thaw in the standoff after the Cold War, that is over. We may wish it wasn't, and hope we can change it and all these things, but it is different, is definitely over, and the competitors are acting accordingly. We are now in an official full-scale strategic and military competition. That's what's going on. And what that means is that all elements of national power, they translate that perception, that reality as they see it, into action. So that means that doctrine, programs, operations are all being upgraded, all being tuned into that perception. And so for doctrine, it means that it's becoming harsher, it's becoming more offensive, it's rebranding some of the missions and some of the profiles of nuclear weapons that had sort of fallen into the background in the past, specifically, for example, tactical nuclear weapons. We see programs such as modernization programs, not just of existing programs, but new weapon systems that are coming in. And we see operations, the way they are being operated, that they're becoming more offensive, they're becoming, in your face, closer to adversaries' territory, explicit messaging with nuclear systems, even nuclear threats, verbal nuclear threats being issued. And of course, we see all the nuclear weapon states falling back on this one. Oh, the world is a very dangerous place, it's very uncertain, and therefore the role of nuclear weapons will have to remain central to our and allied security for the next many years. And so it's this sort of self-licking ice cream cone where they point fingers at each other and therefore go deeper and deeper into this dynamic that we know so well from the Cold War. We are even seeing new weapons being added to so-called strengthening deterrence. As if deterrence wasn't strong enough with the number of weapons and the varieties that exist today. No, there need to be more types of weapons. Some are stuff we've seen in the past that's been, lifted out of the grab bag and reintroduced. Other things are entirely new. Next slide. But I want to just give you some examples of what these three countries are doing. We can go into sort of the headlines with how they're modernizing, what weapons and these types of things, but that's too much in the weeds, I think. I think that it's more important to sort of think about what the activities are that they are doing now. And so what I've tried to capture with these three countries here, first the United States, is how they are adjusting their nuclear business and go about it. And what you see examples of here on the United States side is, top right, we see some very dramatic bomber operations these days. This is a picture from last year where 5 B-52s flew up along Norway, and some of them all the way into the Barents Sea, just a few tens of kilometers from the main Russian strategic nuclear base on the Kola Peninsula. Just last week or 2 weeks ago, we saw another interesting example where B-1 bombers, they are not nuclear, but they're very often viewed as such, but there's a strategic bomber coming down off the Russian Kamchatka Peninsula, and just as it passed, swings right into the Sea of Okhotsk, an area where American bombers have not gone since the Cold War. A clear message that, we're in your face, we can get to you. And so, and down below, you have the picture of the USS Tennessee, which is the first ballistic missile submarine that shortly before Christmas deployed with a new low-yield W76-2 Trident warhead. A weapon concocted by the Trump administration's nuclear posture review as something needed to increase deterrence, and make US appear more willing to use nuclear weapon and not be self-deterred by larger weapons. That's sort of the mind game that justified this system. It's out there both in the Atlantic and the Pacific now. But if you look at how the strategy and the policy documents that shape what the US is doing and thinking have changed, it's been pretty significant. The National Security Strategy from 2017, a clear shift from the war on terror to great power competition. It's literally reinvigorating the standoff, the military standoff, or embracing it that we were in before. We're also seeing an enhanced role, a requirement for expanding the role of nuclear weapons, or the mission or the capacity of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear threats. That we'll come back to what that means later. We saw the Nuclear Posture Review setting or translating the national security strategy into what's required for nuclear forces. It removes restraints on nuclear capabilities, removes prohibition against new weapons, and enhances the role of non-strategic, nuclear weapons against non-nuclear strategic attack. And the non-proliferation profile that we remember that was in the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review has been greatly reduced. We are seeing a general shredding of arms control and international agreements. We have literally what used to be proactive arms control efforts being replaced with the doctrine of complaints and grievances. You will see this again and again in the Trump administration, that what we're hearing is, oh, the Russians don't adhere to this treaty, therefore we're going to throw it out. You cannot have one country in a treaty cheating and then stay in the treaty, et cetera, et cetera. So you use these sort of complaints and grievances arguments rather than thinking about what is the arms control agreement going to achieve. We're also seeing, ironically, an increase in nuclear secrecy these days. During the Obama years, they annually declassified the size of the nuclear stockpile and how many weapons that were being dismantled each year. Very important to tell people, we're not increasing secretly, we're actually, tearing up old nuclear weapons, et cetera. They've stopped doing that. They don't want to show this anymore. And the simplistic hardline argument and justification for this is, well, it has failed to convince Russia and China that they should also disclose their arsenal, therefore we shouldn't have it. So again, this complaints and grievances kind of mentality. And then of course we're seeing, and this has really kicked in after 2014 with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have seen increasing and more offensive operations of nuclear capable forces around the world. That goes both for bomber operations, ballistic missile submarine operations, and we're also seeing brushing off of certain missions in the regional scenarios to sort of make the point that we're serious about nuclear deterrence again. Next one. So on the Russian side, a similar picture started a little earlier. We saw sort of a rebirth, if you will, of Russian long-range bomber operations back in around 2004. But it was sort of standardized bomber operations that, well, you have long-range bombers, you fly far, and they have to train, and they come back and whatever after they had not been doing that for many, many years. But recently, we've also seen them ramping up significantly in the way they operate. So for example, we frequently see these swing overs the Kola Peninsula down along Norway into the North Sea and around Britain. That triggers fighter jets going up from those countries to intercept, as it said, these bombers. We've seen some very dangerous operations like the one in the middle, which is from the Baltic Sea a few years ago, where Russian fighter bombers came out and passed very, very close over American warships that were operating in there. We've seen some explicit threats against other countries, like the lower part is, backfire bombers that conducted simulated nuclear strikes against Sweden in 2015. And we've heard explicit threat against other nuclear weapons. And of course, like the United States, we have a large-scale modernization program. Here it's useful to sort of think about there's part of the modernization program that's about modernizing the existing force, what was there. And there's another part of the modernization program that has to do with adding new capabilities. And so in Russia, we see both. They have a much larger inventory of tactical nuclear weapons than we do in the United States. And so that colors the way that the West looks as Russia's intentions. And it also colors the way that Russia operates and signals with its nuclear forces. Because all of those forces are dual capable. They can both be conventional and nuclear. So it can be hard to see as they deploy, is this a nuclear signal or is it a conventional signal? We also see a growing militarization of the Arctic on the Russian part. All sorts of systems being deployed and spoken about in the area. We've just seen yesterday or 2 days ago the release of a new military strategy or an updated military strategy that, as far as I've been able to read, reaffirms sort of the core missions, but also has a couple of other interesting additions to it. They're not the additions that are sort of, that rocks the boat, but there would be, you know, what you would assume would happen. But of course, one of them is that the issue of using nuclear weapons, if you get signals that a missile attack is underway, how close to underway does it have to be? Do it have to be launched? Do we get warning? Is this launch on attack or launch on warning? All these issues that have to be discussed. And the other one, of course, is sort of similar to what we hear in the United States, that if you attack our strategic assets, even those that are not nuclear weapons themselves, but those that are needed to operate them, for example, command and control systems, et cetera, that could justify our nuclear weapons. But the point is, we're seeing an explicit addition of more scenarios in their military strategy, trying to make the point that we're serious about this. Next, please. China gets a lot of headlines these days because China is right now in a very dynamic phase of its military modernization. We're seeing several new systems, very capable systems coming in. And China, of course, is a country coming up in terms of the nuclear capacity, not by any means close to the capacities that Russia and the United States have, but France, according to my estimates, have just surpassed France as the world's third largest nuclear weapon state in terms of the number of warheads it has in the stockpile. Still way down below Russia and the United States, but nonetheless, it's an important development for China, specifically also because China's modernization of its nuclear forces is happening at the same time that it's in the middle of a much larger modernization of its general conventional forces and the way it operates these forces in its region. And that is setting off a lot of concerns about, you know, China's intentions, of course, et cetera. But I think the big change, of course, is that for decades, the US military was able to operate with impunity off the Chinese coast. China did not have capabilities of any significance. That is changed. Now they have significant conventional capabilities that they exercise. So we're seeing operation closer to Japan, more periodic operations, flying the bombers around these areas. We see annexation of international territory and these constructions of reef islands in the South China Sea. That, of course, is being challenged by the United States under the freedom of navigation and China that insisting it is Chinese territory. And so we have these you know, points of conflict and potential flashpoints in that area. We've also seen China move to building a nuclear triad, formally assigning an operational role of nuclear weapons to its bombers. Unclear why they're doing that. Is it just something you do because that's what you need to do if you're a big military power? Or does it have some implications for how they envision using nuclear weapons, et cetera? From US intelligence officials, we hear very strong worded statements about China's projection. The US Defense Intelligence Agency last year projected that China over the next decade would more than double its nuclear stockpile. So on the lower chart there, I've plotted some of these projections we've seen in the past from DIA and other agencies, and they've always been too much too soon. All the estimates have been wrong, at least the unclassified versions we've seen in public. And so if you believe the latest one, that it will actually pan out, then you would have, in a decade, China having something in the order of about 600 nuclear weapons in its stockpile. That's compared to about 4,000 for Russia and the United States each. Anyway, we can get back to these details, but I think it's just, I wanted to paint this snapshot focused, of course, on modernization, but also on the way that modernization and the new climate we're in is influencing the way they are operated and the way the countries talk about them. Off to the next person.
We are going to move now to our next panelist. Mian is co-director of Princeton University's program on science and global security and manages its project on peace and security in South Asia. He's been contributing to the Assuring Destruction Forever series since 2012. Thank you, Zia, and thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to talk about India and Pakistan, which are both outside the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And it might be worth asking why, when we're talking about the nuclear arms race and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, to include these two countries in this conversation. But India and Pakistan are two of the four countries that are now outside the NPT, the other two being Israel and North Korea. And with 5 countries inside the NPT and 4 outside, any discussion about nuclear dangers and progress towards nuclear disarmament has to deal with the countries outside the NPT as well as those inside the NPT. It's also worth remembering that France and China, who are now inside the NPT, remained outside that treaty for more than 20 years after it entered into force. First China and then France only joined the NPT in 1992. The second observation is that for most people, the idea of an India-Pakistan arms race is taken for granted. It's something that we've seen basically throughout our lives, that these countries have had animus and hostility, occasional crises, and occasional wars. And it's seen as a special case because of their history, that they were one country until 1947. And people often hyphenate the two of them as if somehow this is an inevitable dynamic in their relationship. What it does do is highlight the overwhelming importance of domestic politics in creating the enemy images of the other country, of driving conflicts, of arms racing, and of going to war. And it also explains the primacy of domestic politics in explaining nuclear weapon buildups and modernization. And so it's not just about the abstractions of strategy. Looking carefully at India and Pakistan shows that strategy emerges from domestic politics. These are political choices made by political and military leaders and civilians, and the balance of power between leaders and publics. The photo, for those who are wondering, is the India-Pakistan border. And the photo was taken by an astronaut on the International Space Station. And the bright white spot at the bottom is the city of Karachi in Pakistan, which is home to 1 in 10 of Pakistan's entire population. And it's only a couple of 100 miles from the India border. So the geography matters, history matters, and domestic politics matters when trying to understand nuclear weapons programs and nuclear arms racing modernization. Next slide, please. So I'm going to focus on the period since 1998 and the nuclear tests in May of that year, first by India and then Pakistan, which really highlighted the weapons programs in these countries to the world in a dramatic fashion. Since that time, we've seen a very explicit, overt public development of nuclear arsenals and capabilities in both countries, and a vivid embrace of nuclear weapons by leaders in both countries. Prime ministers of both countries have been seen launching submarines at missile tests, embracing the nuclear weapon program as a show of what you might call nuclear nationalism. That look at what I have, and because I have it, I am strong and my state is strong. This period since 1998 has also brought multiple military and nuclear crises and a recurring use of military force by these two countries against each other. And in 1999, they actually went to war. So the idea that having nuclear weapons calms relationships between countries and restrains them is put into profound question by the India-Pakistan experience of explicitly testing nuclear weapons, trying to demonstrate their deterrence, and yet continuously having armed conflict and one war. And the most recent conflict erupted in last year when fighter jets were used by both India and Pakistan against each other for the first time since their war in 1971. We could have avoided a lot of what we've seen in the last 2 decades since the nuclear tests, if the international community had actually played a more assertive role in dealing with the nuclear developments in South Asia. In June of 1998, 1 month after the nuclear tests, the UN Security Council unanimously passed Resolution 1172, which called upon Pakistan to stop their nuclear weapons programs, to refrain from weaponization or deployment, to cease production of fissile material. This is the plutonium and highly enriched uranium that is the nuclear and nuclear weapon, and to cease the development of ballistic missiles. You could not have asked for a clearer statement of what the international community would like to do in getting ahead of nuclear arms races. And yet, none of the members of the Security Council, and by and large, the rest of the international community, has not acted on this resolution. It's like it was never passed, and as a consequence, much of what we've seen since then in terms of nuclear buildup has unfolded. Next slide, please. So when you look at the ground truths of what's actually happened in South Asia, both countries have weaponized dramatically from having perhaps a handful of simple nuclear weapons each at the time of the nuclear tests to having large-scale ongoing production of nuclear weapons. And the assessments that Hans Kristensen and his colleagues have made regularly over 2 decades suggest that they may have about 150 nuclear weapons each. So they're reaching the kind of half the scale of the arsenals of Britain, France, and China. And there's no prospect of them ending their increased production. The production of fissile materials, both countries have increased their stockpiles of both plutonium and highly enriched uranium, the key ingredients for nuclear weapons. And critically, they have been expanding the scale of their production capability, building new facilities to make more material for weapons. And this has involved a large commitment of time and money, and building facilities. Once such facilities are built, experience shows they become very hard to close down because of the pressure from the organizations and institutions responsible for these facilities. They're building a nuclear military industrial complex that will be very hard to shut down. Both countries have made a lot of progress in developing land-based, air-based, and sea-based nuclear weapons. Many of their weapons are believed to be kept in some kind of centralized storage, but they now all have this capability to deploy these weapons in these multiple ways. And the key delivery systems, ballistic missiles and other kinds of missiles, both countries have demonstrated and continue to develop a diverse and increasingly sophisticated fleet of such systems. And this is the most obvious expression that one can see of this. Next slide, please. So this slide just kind of lists, just so you can get a shock value sense of how far these two countries have come in developing nuclear weapons delivery systems, other than the airplanes that they have as well. So Pakistan has an entire set of missiles with ranges from 60 kilometers to use on the nuclear battlefield against Indian tanks and soldiers, all the way up to missiles with ranges in excess of 2,000 kilometers, some of which may be able to carry multiple warheads. And Pakistan also has both air-launched, ground-launched, and sea-launched cruise missiles. India also has a similar large array of ballistic missiles, ranging from a few hundred kilometers up to possibly a system still under development, which would have an intercontinental ballistic missile capability of 8,000 to 10,000 kilometer range, and also a range of increasingly complex and far-ranging ballistic missiles for use in their nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed submarine fleet that they're building. And they're expecting to perhaps have at least 4 such nuclear armed submarines, one of which is already at sea and others are under construction. So you can see that in 20 years, they've come a long way in building up their capabilities, and it's not clear where this capability development will conclude, because neither side shows any sign of restraint. Next slide, please. So let me just sum up some of the dynamics that are at work. I've highlighted the role of domestic politics in Pakistan and in India. There are issues of state building. These are still developing countries, and the state in both countries believes that having a strong technological military capacity you can demonstrate goes hand in hand with building state power, because only states can do this. There's also economic growth is driving these kinds of programs. And ideas, as Hans Kristensen mentioned, of national power, that if I have a strong, rich state, then I have a powerful state, and that's what matters in the world system that we have. In Pakistan, there are issues of the military domination of political decision-making. But in India, while you don't have the same military dominance of decision-making, there is long-standing great power ambition. India is more than 1 billion people and believes that as an ancient civilization, it has a special role to play in the world. And critically in India, there is an increasingly important emerging military industrial complex that is emerging. And when you start to make large investments in military systems and facilities, which take decades to build and are expected to last for decades, then you're building institutions that will resist efforts to restrain them, and they will have political pressure to expand, modernize, and keep going. This is exactly what we've seen in the United States and the Soviet Union-Russia competition, where Cold War systems were not completely dismantled, weapons laboratories, military manufacturing, missile programs. And so now they all have a second lease of life. In India and Pakistan, you also have competing nationalisms, and as I mentioned, a history of wars and conflicts. But a new dynamic is the India-China dynamic that has complicated this kind of bipolar relationship many people assume is the only thing that's at work. India and China are having a strategic political competition. They've had one war in 1962. There are border disputes, and India sees itself as entitled to equal standing with China in the world system. There's a Pakistan-China dynamic that is at play. They've been strategic partners since the 1960s, and the Chinese have explicitly helped Pakistan with weapons, including nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, and huge amounts of military aid and modern weapon systems. And China is increasingly replacing the United States as Pakistan's historical ally. And that brings us to the Pakistan-US dynamic. The Pakistan and the US were allies since the 1950s. They were partners in 2 Afghan wars. And just to give you a measure that while Pakistan is building up this vast nuclear capability, the US has given Pakistan $34 billion in aid in the past 20 years. Mostly because of wanting Pakistan's support in the war against the Taliban in Afghanistan. And that teaches an important lesson that when it comes to nuclear weapons, strategic interests of other kinds often overwhelm concerns about nuclear arms racing. The Pakistan-US alliance has now basically unraveled. And a new one that has emerged is the India-US strategic partnership. This began with the visit by Bill Clinton to India in the year 2000 and was formalized in the next steps in strategic partnership agreement signed between India and the Bush administration, which promised US support for Indian civilian nuclear activities, space programs, dual-use high technology trade, which includes military systems as well as missile defense. And this was driven by an effort by the United States to recruit India into the new emerging Cold War competition with China. And this is now being turned into what the US calls a comprehensive global strategic partnership. That was the name given in February 2020 during the President Trump, Prime Minister Modi summit. And that talks about a US-India strategic convergence against China. And the last and new polarizing dynamic that is driving this and will shape the India-Pakistan build-up for decades to come is the US-Chinese hegemonic competition for who gets to dominate the shape of the world order in coming decades. And with the US on one side as a partner with India and China on the other side as a partner with Pakistan, this is going to become increasingly a critical driver in the US, India, Pakistan, China arms racing dynamic with the transfer of weapons, capabilities, and interests. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Next up, we have Alicia Saunders-Zachary, who's the Policy and Research Coordinator at the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. She directs and coordinates research on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, and general nuclear weapons policy. Thanks very much for being with us today, Alicia.
Thank you so much for having me. So I'm really glad to be here today to talk about ICANN's recent research on global nuclear weapons spending and how it relates to the NPT. So in a recent report that ICANN put out, we found that the 9 nuclear-armed countries spent nearly $73 billion on their nuclear weapons last year. And here you see an overview of each of those countries' spending. You can see that the US spent by far the most on its nuclear weapons, but all of these countries spent billions of dollars on nuclear weapons in 2019. Next slide, please. So to put that in context, that means that 9 countries spent nearly $140,000 each minute on nuclear weapons in 2019. And using the same methodology that we used for 2019, we also calculated 2018 costs and found there was an increase of about $7 billion from 2018 to 2019. Next slide, please. So I want to give you a little explanation of how we came to these calculations. Each country's costs includes both nuclear warheads and nuclear capable delivery systems, operating costs and development costs to build and update these weapons. They're based on, where available, open source annual budget documents and regional experts' estimates, largely of total military expenditures, relying on some of the great work of these panelists and the hosts of this webinar. What we know is that while this methodology we were able to apply across countries, there's additional costs related to nuclear weapons that we were not able to include in this estimate due to lack of consistent and reliable information. So the full cost of nuclear weapons in any given year is likely much higher, and that includes payments for victims of nuclear weapons use and testing through victim assistance programs, as well as the costs that many countries face to remediate land contaminated by nuclear weapons. We have more detailed explanations of each country's calculation in the full report, and I'm happy to also answer questions about that in the Q&A. Next slide, please. So, this slide just gives a snapshot of how this money could be spent elsewhere. And I think just touching on what we heard in the introduction to this webinar, this is a really challenging time for global security in the midst of a global pandemic. And of course, seeing the police brutality and the violence that people of color are facing around the world. And every dollar that is spent on nuclear weapons and every $1 billion that is spent on nuclear weapons in these countries could be providing life-saving supplies and funding movements for racial equality and for other justice in the world. So this is one example. The sources for these numbers are available on our website. Next slide, please. So what does this all have to do with the NPT? So I would refer you all to Article 6 of the NPT, which many of you are familiar with, calling for all states parties to pursue the end of the nuclear arms race and nuclear disarmament. And as we've heard earlier in this panel, all of the spending on nuclear weapons in each of these countries is fueling the arms race as countries both expand their arsenals quantitatively and pursue more advanced weapons types in their countries. Next slide, please. So, we know that in Article 6 of the NPT and in the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which complements the NPT by implementing Article 6, there is a strong legal case for divestment for countries to, companies within countries to divest from nuclear weapons. The PAX organization based in the Netherlands produces annual research on which companies are investing in nuclear weapons and which financial institutions are divesting from those companies. And also shows that actually a major factor in the decision of financial institutions to divest from companies associated with nuclear weapons is that weapon status under international law. So both Article 6 in the NPT and the TPNW help to build the case for divestment within countries from companies that work on nuclear weapons. And we've already seen some of this work in action with local resolution in New York, the likely place of the NPT Review Conference, calling for a divestment of New York City pension funds from companies involved in the production and maintenance of nuclear weapons. And currently that resolution, there's been a hearing on that resolution where a number of constituents spoke in favor of it, but it still needs to be taken to a vote. Next slide, please. So just in conclusion, in seeing the massive amounts of money that are being spent on nuclear weapons by 9 countries every year, it's clear that there are steps for the international community to be taking in the context of the NPT. And that includes all states parties calling for a full implementation of Article 6 and condemning both the quantitative and qualitative advancement of nuclear arsenals. And also for, if there are any listeners from New York, you can call on your council members, New York City council members, to bring resolution 976 to a vote and to co-sponsor that resolution. And I'm happy to share my slides after the presentation or provide information on those recommendations. I'll yield to the next panelist.
I'm going to turn now to our final panelist, to Toni Juarez, who's a Mexican career diplomat since 1994. She's been posted to Vienna, Geneva, and is political coordinator at the Permanent Mission of Mexico since 2016. She was acting Director General for the UN at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Mexico in 2015 to 2016, and Deputy Director General for Disarmament of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Mexico between 2012 and 2015. So thank you very much for being here with us today, Toni.
Thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to comment on some of these issues from the point of view of non-nuclear weapon states in the context of the NPT and elsewhere. In the interest of time, I will start by saying that the issue of the cessation of the nuclear arms race is the heart of the Article 6 of the NPT, as ICANN has already reminded us, but it is also one of the most important pending assignments of the United Nations. We have had this issue in the multilateral discussions for years, and the review conference of the NPT is going to take place under very dire circumstances because of all the data that we have already seen in the previous presentations and slides, and there is a sense of crisis around the discussions of the NPT. So I want to start by saying that this is not the first time that the NPT will reunite or join its parties under these difficult circumstances, and that the arms race has taken a long time in the United Nations discussions, as I said before. So what is different now, and why we have to take a different action, and from the point of view of the non-nuclear weapon states? Especially, we need to look at what's happening now. The pandemic situation is giving us a chance not only to reflect before the review conference takes place, but also to consider an introspective exercise on how multilateralism has permeated and changed the perception around nuclear weapons. So I have to say, and I don't want to sound very apologetic about the multilateral disarmament fora, but I have to mention that the solution, or the natural solution of the United Nations to the arms race, was creating a fora to discuss these issues. And the difference between the 1960s and 50s, where we had the peak of the arms race, full blast speed, and nowadays, is that there is a disdain for the multilateral fora, as well as the dismantlement of treaties that was already addressed by the panelists. So we need to talk about what to do with the fora as well as with the treaties. In this regard, one has to remember that the conference on disarmament in Geneva, that is very dysfunctional and that has been paralyzed for many years, is still the only of the fora that gathers the 9 possessors of nuclear weapons and the countries under the nuclear extended deterrence agreements. So it is very symptomatic that the conference on disarmament has not been able to come to an agreement on how to proceed. At the same time that there is this talk about how to uphold treaties and uphold multilateralism. So this is the first thing that I have to mention as a signing alarm of what to do in the future. Then the second thing that we have to take into consideration is precisely the pandemic. And as we have said before, as the government of Mexico, but also in this panel, we have to pay attention to the contrast, the very insulting contrast between the $73 billion spent in modernizing and upholding nuclear weapons and conserving nuclear weapons, and the race for medicines and for development goals, and for sustaining a rebuilt society after the pandemic, and how we are going to rebuild better, to use the words of the Secretary General. So nuclear weapon states are always functioning under this perception and this consideration of how these weapons are useful for security, and for their security and for peace. And the reason, if I have to summarize, the reason why there is always permanent tension at the disarmament fora, and that the decision-making processes at the disarmament fora are sometimes hindered, is that the non-nuclear weapon states, or the rest of the world, believe that the weapons are not the sustaining foundation for peace, and that disarmament might be an incentive for peace. And this, in the 1960s, was a very revolutionary idea that came into being and a concrete outcome in the nuclear weapon-free zones. And I am amazed of how many times nuclear weapons-free zones are forgotten in this debate, because the 6 nuclear weapon-free zones have demonstrated historically with concrete steps that nuclear weapons are not needed for the security of the region in question, but also they have demonstrated that it is a sovereign decision, a political decision, the so-called political will that we ask from the nuclear weapon states, that has decided that some countries forget about the nuclear option and decide with legally binding agreements that they are going to make a contribution to peace and security, and that they are going to separate themselves from the proliferation trends and the nuclear race. So nuclear weapon-free zones must be looked at also as a way to contrast the assumption and the perception that nuclear weapons are necessary. So I want to say finally that all these comes to the upholding of multilateral agreements that we have already made in the past. And in that regard, I want to draw the attention of the public to a statement that 17 countries, non-nuclear weapon states, signed recently, because this joint communique signed by the governments of Algeria, Austria, Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Egypt, Indonesia, Malaysia, Morocco, New Zealand, Nigeria, Philippines, South Africa, Thailand, and my government, Mexico, is not a common position. But it shows what the priorities are for the non-nuclear weapon states for the NPT Review Conference. It also shows that there is the need to highlight two issues at the review conference that have a little bit of background, of course, in the previous conferences, but also that have to be related to what's happening right now. And that is first, of course, the relation between disarmament and development that is exemplified by these findings that I can mention and that I have already talked about how is it going to be possible for the nuclear weapon states to justify the very absurd expense on nuclear weapons when the whole world is chasing resources. The second thing is the need for because of this divide about what nuclear weapons mean for security in different regions, and also because of this lack of incentive for multilateral dialogue, we need to come back to an evolution in the dialogue and make the human beings at the center of all public policy. And in nuclear disarmament, we have already taken some steps since 2010 because we have talked about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and their prevention as the basis of all the actions in the NPT and elsewhere. And I think that this is the thread, the common thread that is now motivating governments to speak. The humanity is being threatened by nuclear weapons since its inception. And we need tangible progress in nuclear disarmament because of that. The whole NPT is based on the assumption of preventing a nuclear war, but preventing the threat to humanity posed by nuclear weapons must come back to the center of the debate, because before the pandemic, we were already concerned about the banalization of the use of nuclear weapons or the voices advocating for the use of nuclear weapons. And we have already been observing this trend of strengthening of nuclear deterrence, of new calls for the modernization and the expansion of arsenals, and the very lax way in which nuclear weapon states started to threaten again each other, which was a new scenario that other review conferences didn't leave before. So I want to end by saying that this transit towards a more human-centered approach to public policy needs to be one of the most important priorities, because it is not an end in itself, but it must be the reason for the acceleration in the implementation of the obligations and commitments that we already have under the NPT. And for the other countries participating in this race, we need to find a new revitalization of the multilateral fora. As I said, there are some venues in which they are sitting together, and we need to continue motivating the revitalization of these fora. It is very difficult to revitalize something that is thought to be very healthy or to be in very good shape. So first we need to acknowledge that there are a lot of disincentives for the decision-making process in these fora. I want to end by reminding them, each other, that the question is the same that guided, for example, the women's strike for peace in 1961, which is we need to end the arms race and not the human race. And this is the only incentive, objective, and foundation for all the work that we need to do at the United Nations and the non-nuclear weapon states, and all the countries under nuclear weapon-free zones have the primary responsibility of not accepting these voices that call for the modernization of nuclear weapons or for the expansion of arsenals and for the use of nuclear weapons as the new normal, especially when we end the new normal after the pandemic. I would end up here and would be glad to answer some questions in writing or in live. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
We have, I think, since we're over time, we'll just read out, I think, 2 questions that have not yet been answered that I think some of the panelists might want the chance to comment on. One is from Ardith Platt, which is, how can countries be held accountable under the NPT for their practices today, like modernization and building new nuclear weapons? Others were asking about the possibility of new nuclear testing. So how can we use the tools that we have to hold these countries accountable, is one question. And then I have another question from Reto from Switzerland. Is there a chance that in certain contexts, less spending on nuclear weapons could lead to an increase in the spending on conventional weapons? So that's, of course, something that we hear all the time, that if not nuclear, then there will be other investments in militarism. So if any of the panelists would like to respond to these 2 questions, and of course can continue responding in writing. Thank you very much.
Can
Yes,
I answer Reto's?
Yes, I see that Tony, Hans, and Zia would like to speak. So let's go in that order. Tony, Hans, Zia. Thanks.
Yeah, just very quickly, an answer to the question of how to hold accountable. So this is a very important question, because a lot of parties, unfortunately, choose not to recognize that there has been a breach in compliance from the point of view of the parties of the NPT, or engage in the naming and shaming exercise that has characterized much of the debate lately, instead of using the treaty or the fora provided by the treaty to address the lack of fulfillment of obligations as a fact. What I am saying is that there is always a struggle between saying we cannot agree on whether the treaty is being implemented or not, and let's forget about that and leave that out of the declaration. For example, if we want an outcome document, this is in the context of the NPT. I personally believe that it is possible to make an assessment of how much the treaty has been implemented. For example, we can recognize all the reductions that have taken place that were eloquently explained by Hans before me. But we also have to agree that there has not been multilateral verification of some of this reduction, because there is no mechanism for that. And then maybe we can agree on some form of multilateral verification of some of these numbers, and that would show movement in the discussion, instead of saying, yes, there were reductions and that is the fulfillment of our obligations from the point of view of the nuclear weapon states, and then the non-nuclear weapon states states saying there has been no progress in nuclear disarmament at all. Why haven't you fulfilled your obligations when we are fulfilling ours, and then not moving at all in an outcome or in concrete progress?
Thank you. I also wanted to address the question about accountability. It's often forgotten that the NPT exists within the structure of the United Nations system. It does not exist outside that structure. It was agreed as part of the 18-nation committee that was set up as part of the United Nations structure. The United Nations is explicitly mentioned in the treaty on more than one occasion. And critically, if a country seeks to withdraw from the NPT, in other words, if there is a compliance issue, then it has to explain to the Security Council of the United Nations the extraordinary events that have taken place that require it to withdraw from the treaty. So the United Nations is written into the NPT, and the NPT only has existence because of the United Nations structure. I think that gives us several opportunities to deal with this question directly. And one of those is that if there is an issue whether nuclear weapon modernization programs, at least by the parties to the treaty, is an issue, then the countries of the NPT could go to the General Assembly of the United Nations and say, we agreed to set up this treaty. Now we want the General Assembly to decide if this treaty is actually being fulfilled by its parties. And so that would be one mechanism where a General Assembly resolution could rule on the fact of whether nuclear weapon modernization is actually a violation of the treaty as far as the General Assembly decides. The General Assembly could also take it to the World Court of the United Nations and ask for a ruling on whether this is an issue of compliance or non-compliance. And the General Assembly has gone to the World Court before, and it could do so again, specifically on this question of nuclear weapons modernization by NPT parties as a violation of the treaty. So there are at least a couple of options, and there are probably more.
Okay, Hans, please.
Yeah, just 2 points. One, on that issue about fulfillment and in compliance. I think the arguments that countries, the nuclear weapon states have made in the NPT context about we have been reducing, we've been trying to negotiate, you know, it may not be perfect, but at least there's progress to some extent. Those are arguments they could make a few years ago. But today the situation is fundamentally different. I mean, we've seen the arms control architecture falling apart and being axed, and we see a resurgence in the role of nuclear weapons and modernization programs that are explicitly stated intended to last almost to the end of this century. So, you know, yeah, how many angels can dance on the tip of a needle? But the point is just it's fundamentally different right now than it was, I think, 5 years ago about these issues. I want to just answer specifically Redo's questions. It's a good question. If there's a chance that in certain contexts, less spending on nuclear weapons could lead to an increase in the spending on conventional weapons. And yes, absolutely, that is real. And not only is there a chance, that is happening. The point being that if you take the United States, for example, the selling of the strategy of how to reduce the number of nuclear weapons, and especially the reliance on nuclear weapons for regional scenarios, in the Obama administration, were explicitly sold as the way we're going to do that is by increasing conventional. So that was the explicit connection and condition between those two. In reality, of course, it means they're doing both. You know, you're not going to see them suddenly waking up and saying because nuclear weapons are now more in the international profile, therefore, oh, let's slow down on conventional. It's all happening at the same time. But I do think that that link is an explicit link that was deliberate also during the Obama administration.
Okay, thank you. I'll pass to Alicia now.
I'll just add a few more comments. I agree with a lot of what the other panelists have said about the compliance issue and modernization of the NPT. I think, you know, as a short-term step, as I said at the end of my presentation, it's very important for states parties to be calling out this failure to uphold and implement a key article, Article 6 of the treaty, at the upcoming review conference. And that's another important way to make sure that, that these steps are recognized and called out. As regards to Redo's question, again, I agree with some of what has already been said, but I think it really is important to recognize, as Hans said, that currently countries are doing both. You know, it's not like countries are foregoing conventional nuclear spending to be spending on nuclear weapons. The deficits that we're seeing and the gaps in security structures in countries are how they are prepared to deal with a global pandemic, how they're prepared to deal with climate change. And, you know, the one, if you can call it a silver lining of these really challenging and terrifying times that we live in, is that I think there is a broader recognition that weapons and militaries don't secure states and don't save lives. And instead, there's a lot of other more important global threats that countries need to be working on cooperatively and diverting funds to really address.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to read out one more question and then we're going to wrap up this session. There will be a way for other questions to possibly be answered, which I will discuss at the end. But for now, if any panelists would like to address the question from Thomas Schmidt about what consequences for the modernization of the B-61 bombs of nuclear sharing in Europe would be expected if Germany were to withdraw from the sharing arrangements. Is there anybody that would like to address that?
Well, I could give a few comments to it, because I don't think if Germany withdrew from nuclear sharing that would affect the program necessarily in Europe. And the reason I'm saying this is that it's not that it wouldn't be controversial, a big decision and all that kind of stuff. But the point is that, you know, Greece has already pulled out. They had B-61s on their territory. The arrangement didn't collapse because of that. Germany pulling out is a bigger item, of course, if they did that. But I also think that the B-61 is a bigger issue than just Europe. If you look at the military requirement for this one is not, despite what you hear primarily about the sharing mission in Europe and things, but that is primarily driven by the US military, the US Air Force's own requirement for this weapon system on its strategic bombers. And so even if the whole sharing arrangement fell away in Europe, that wouldn't stop the B-61 program. So that's just, you know, an obvious point.
Okay, Alicia?
There's just one component that I'd like to add around the debate around hosting nuclear weapons, particularly in Germany, which is that I think it's not included enough what the general population in Germany thinks about having weapons of mass destruction on their territory. And we've produced some polls showing that the majority of people in Germany actually support getting rid of those weapons and joining the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And we saw when there was, you know, one interview by the head of the German Social Democratic Party, the people who pushed back against this call to remove weapons were, you know, Jens Stoltenberg of NATO and the US ambassador to Germany quickly put out op-eds. But, you know, the people of Germany have consistently reported in polls that they support taking these weapons out. So I think it's really important to include this perspective and take it into account in this debate.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you to all of the panelists and the participants today. Just a note also that some of the questions that popped up today were related to implementation of the NPT, in particular Article 6, and that will be a topic of one of our forthcoming webinars in this series. So don't worry, there will be plenty more time to discuss these issues in the coming months. Thank you again very much for everyone for joining us. We will make this recording available in the near future, and the panelists will make their slides available as well, and we'll make sure that you receive all of that information. Thanks very much.